The wind had teeth, and it was biting hard at the edges of Redemption Gulch. Eli Hartley felt it on the back of his neck, a cold promise of what was coming. He leaned against the rough-hewn porch post of the general store. His weight settled on one leg, his hat pulled low. His gaze was fixed on the pass, a jagged cut in the gray muscle of the mountains where the stagecoach road disappeared. It was the last one. After this, the snows would close that pass like a fist, and the world would shrink to the size of his valley until spring. He was not a man given to impatience, but a quiet tension coiled in his gut. Answering the advertisement in the Matrimonial Times had been an act of pure, cold logic. His homestead was 2 days' ride from anywhere, a lonely patch of existence carved out of timber and rock. Winters were the worst. The silence grew so loud it felt like a presence in the cabin, a ghost that sat in the empty chair across from him. He didn't need a wife for love. The notion was as foreign and impractical as raising orchids in a blizzard. He needed a partner, someone to share the burden, to keep the crushing solitude at bay. The advertisement he'd answered had been simple: plain woman of good character, seeking a husband and a home, willing to work and share the burdens of a frontier life. He'd sent back an equally spare reply, enclosing the fare for her passage. He expected someone sturdy, with hands used to work and a face weathered by practicality. He expected a woman who understood survival. The distant rumble and creak grew louder, and finally, the Concord stagecoach lurched into view, coated in a fine layer of dust that looked like a premonition of snow. It pulled to a halt in a jangle of tired harnesses and the blowing of weary horses. A few townsfolk, bundled in wool and buckskin, paused their errands to watch. The arrival of the stage was always an event, but the last one of the season carried a special weight. It was the final link to the world outside, and everyone who got off it was here to stay, for better or worse. The driver, a burly man named Silas, whose beard was stiff with ice, swung down and opened the door. A man in a drummer's suit got out first, stamping his feet and looking around with disdain. Then, after a long pause, she appeared. A collective murmur rippled through the onlookers. This was not what anyone had expected, least of all Eli. The woman who stepped down onto the frozen mud was thin, so slender a hard wind looked like it might carry her away. She was trembling, a fine, constant tremor that shook the delicate lace collar of her dress. The dress itself was a whisper of a thing, made of dark blue wool, but trimmed with the kind of fragile adornments meant for Eastern parlors, not the raw edge of the wilderness. It was wholly inadequate for the cold, and she seemed to fold into herself, her arms wrapped tight around her body. Eli pushed himself off the post. He saw the looks, heard the whispers. Too fine for this place. Look at her, a sparrow in a hawk's nest. Hartley's got himself a porcelain doll. He ignored them. His world had long since been pared down to what was necessary, and the opinions of others had been one of the first things to go. He walked toward her, his boots making a solid, rhythmic sound on the hard-packed dirt. Her head was down, but she must have sensed his approach because she flinched when he stopped in front of her. Her eyes, when she finally lifted them, were the color of a winter sky just before a storm, a deep and troubled gray. They were wide with a fear that had nothing to do with the cold. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked. His voice was rough from disuse, like a rusty hinge. She gave a short, jerky nod, her throat working as if to swallow a word that wouldn't come. The wind gusted again, whipping a strand of her dark brown hair across her pale cheek. She shivered violently, without a second thought. Eli shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat. It was worn and smelled of pine smoke, leather, and the cold, clean air of the mountains. He held it out to her. As his hand brushed her arm, she recoiled. It was not a large movement, just a sharp, involuntary jerk, as if she'd been burned. Her eyes darted to his hand, then back to his face, wild with an alarm. He did not understand. For a moment, he thought she might bolt. He held his ground, his hand still extended, the coat a silent offering. He kept his expression neutral, his posture relaxed, the way he would with a spooked mare. Finally, the logic of the cold won out over her fear. She gave another tiny nod, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. She allowed him to drape the heavy coat over her narrow shoulders. It swallowed her whole, the sleeves hanging far past her hands, the hem brushing her ankles. She clutched the lapels together at her throat, a small, dark figure lost in a sea of weathered sheepskin. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were barely carried on the wind. He retrieved her luggage, a single, battered satchel that she'd kept beside her on the coach seat. She reached for it immediately, her fingers closing around the handle with a desperate grip, as if it contained all the breath she had left in her body. "My wagon's over here," he said, gesturing with his head. The ride back to his homestead was steeped in a thick, unbreachable silence. The wagon wheels groaned in the ruts of the frozen road, and the wind moaned through the pines that lined the trail. Eli sat straight, his hands sure on the reins, his focus on the path ahead. He was acutely aware of the woman beside him, a rigid presence of fear and cold. She did not look at the scenery, at the stark and brutal beauty of the high country. She stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on nothing, her knuckles white where she gripped the handle of her satchel. He hazarded a glance at her. Her profile was delicate, a finely carved thing, but it was drawn and tight with exhaustion and strain. She looked like a woman who had been running for a very long time and had only just now stopped to realize there was nowhere left to go. The silence between them wasn't companionable. It was a chasm, and Eli had no idea how to build a bridge across it. He thought of things to say, questions about her journey, but they all felt like intrusions. He was a man who spoke when something needed saying, and right now, the silence felt safer than any word he could think of. It was near dusk when they arrived. His cabin was nestled in a small clearing, backed by a dense wall of lodgepole pines, with a clear view of the valley below. It was a solid structure, built by his own hands from the trees he'd felled. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, a lonely gray ribbon against the darkening sky. To him, it was home, a fortress against the wilderness and the winter. To her, he suspected, it looked like the end of the world. He helped her down from the wagon, careful not to touch her. Inside, the main room was spare but orderly. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a fire already banked and glowing. A rough-sawn table and 2 chairs stood in the center. His bed, a simple frame with a thick wool blanket, occupied one corner. The air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee. "The stove is there," he said, pointing. "It keeps the place warm. The well is out back, but I brought in extra water for tonight." He led her to a small room sectioned off from the main living space by a newly built wooden wall. It was not much more than an alcove, just big enough for the narrow bed he'd built, a small washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a single nail on the wall for her clothes. He had put his mother's old quilt on the bed, a faded patchwork of blues and greens. It was the only soft thing in the entire cabin. "This will be your room," he said. She stepped inside, her movements stiff and uncertain. She ran a hand over the quilt, her touch feather-light. She looked around the small space, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she turned to him, her eyes still holding that deep, shadowed look. "Thank you, Mr. Hartley," she said, her voice low and formal. It is very clean." He just nodded. As she set her satchel down on the floor, he saw her hands properly for the first time in the lamplight. The backs of them, from the knuckles to the wrists, were mottled with dark, ugly bruises, the color of faded violets and sickly yellow. The sight was a jolt, a piece of a puzzle he didn't know he was solving. "How did you hurt your hands?" he asked, his tone more direct than he intended. Her gaze flew to her hands, and she quickly tried to hide them in the folds of her dress. "I fell," she said. The lie was as stark and plain as the bruises themselves. Her voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, and her eyes refused to meet his. "During the journey, I am clumsy." Eli did not press her. He knew a wall when he saw one, and this woman was surrounded by them. He turned away, busying himself by adding a log to the fire. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the single glass pane of the window. He looked out and saw them, the first fat, white flakes of snow, swirling in the twilight. They were falling faster now, a thick and silent curtain descending upon the world. The pass would be closed by morning. They were stranded together. He cooked a stew of salted venison and potatoes, a thick, hearty meal meant to fight off the cold. The smell filled the small cabin, a comforting, domestic scent that felt alien in the charged silence. He served her a bowl, and she took it with another murmured, "Thank you." They ate at the small table, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against earthenware and the howl of the wind outside. He ate steadily, his appetite unaffected by the strangeness of the situation. She, however, merely pushed the food around her bowl. She took a few small bites, her movements slow and deliberate, as if the act of eating required immense concentration. After a few minutes, she put her spoon down. "I'm not very hungry," she said, by way of an apology. "The travel—" "You need to eat," he said, not unkindly. "Winter takes its toll." She nodded, but did not pick up the spoon again. When the meal was done, he cleared the table. She stood, seeming unsure of what to do with herself. "I believe I will retire," she said finally, her voice sounding formal and out of place. "It has been a long day." "Good night, Mrs. Whitmore." "Cora," she corrected him softly. "My name is Cora." "Cora," he repeated. The name felt strange on his tongue. He watched her retreat into the small room and pull the simple canvas curtain he'd hung for a door. He sat by the fire for a long time, listening to the storm rage outside. The snow was coming down hard now, piling up against the cabin walls. He was used to being alone, but this was a new kind of solitude, a loneliness shared with a stranger. He thought about the bruises on her hands and the lies she'd told. He thought about the fear in her eyes, a fear that was old and deep-seated. He had wanted a partner for survival, but he had a feeling the woman behind that curtain was surviving something far worse than a mountain winter. Later, as he lay in his own bed, the fire banked to glowing embers. He heard it, a sound so quiet he almost missed it beneath the fury of the wind. It was the sound of weeping. Not a loud, keening grief, but a choked, muffled sorrow. The kind a person makes when they are trying to cry without being heard. It was the sound of utter brokenness. Eli lay perfectly still, staring into the darkness. Every instinct he had was to do something, to fix what was broken. But he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was a hurt he could not reach. He had no words for it, so he said nothing, and just listened to her cry through the wall. She lay on the narrow cot, the unfamiliar quilt pulled up to her chin, and cried into the pillow to muffle the sound. The tears were not for the cold, or the strange, silent man in the other room, or the terrifying wilderness that now surrounded her. The tears were for a ghost. Her secret had a name, Julian Whitmore, her husband. In her mind, she was back in Philadelphia, in the grand house with the towering ceilings and the suffocating velvet drapes. She had been Cora Maywood then, the daughter of a merchant whose fortunes had soured. Julian had seemed like a savior. He was wealthy, handsome, a pillar of society. He'd courted her with flowers and poetry, his words as smooth and polished as the mahogany in his study. He had promised to cherish her, to protect her. But possession was not protection, and cherishing had quickly become a matter of ownership. He had loved her the way a man loves a prized porcelain vase, beautiful to look at, valuable to own, but fragile and easily replaceable. At first, his control had been subtle, a quiet disapproval of a dress he deemed too vibrant, a suggestion that her friends were not of a suitable station, a tightening of his fingers on her arm in a crowded room, a silent command to be still, to smile. Soon, the quiet disapproval had grown a voice, a cold, cutting tone that flayed her spirit in the privacy of their opulent bedroom. He told her she was simple, that her thoughts were uninteresting. He corrected her speech, her posture, her very way of being, chipping away at her until she felt like a poorly made statue he was constantly trying to reshape. He had treated her like property. Then it had become less property, at least, has value. When his business dealings began to fail, when the whispers of his impending ruin started to circulate, his cruelty found a new, sharper edge. The cold words were joined by a cold fury. A book thrown across the room, a glass of wine dashed against the wall, and then his hands, a grip on her wrist that left a bracelet of bruises, a shove that sent her stumbling into the furniture. He had never struck her face. He was too careful, too mindful of appearances for that. But he had taught her that pain could be delivered in 1,000 other ways. He had treated her like less than nothing. The bruises on her hands now were from the end. He had discovered her plan to leave. She had sewn a small amount of money into the hem of her plainest dress. He had found it. The ensuing argument had been the worst yet. He had grabbed her satchel, trying to wrench it from her. She had fought back, a desperate, feral strength she didn't know she possessed. She had clutched that bag like it was her very soul, and in the struggle, he had slammed her hands, again and again, against the hard corner of a dresser. "You are mine," he had hissed, his face a mask of rage. "You will go nowhere." But she had, that night, while he slept in a drunken stupor, she had taken her satchel and fled, using the last of her hidden money not for a train to another city, but for a stagecoach ticket to a place so far away, so different from her world. She prayed he would never think to look for her. She had answered the first advertisement she found, a plea from a man named Eli Hartley in a place she could not even pronounce. It had sounded like the end of the earth. It had sounded safe. Now, lying in the dark, listening to the blizzard, she was not so sure. The cabin felt like another cage, and the silent, imposing man in the next room was her new keeper. She wept until there were no tears left, a dry, hollow ache in her chest. Cora woke before dawn. The cabin was frigid, the fire having burned down to pale, sleeping coals. For a moment, she was disoriented, the rough texture of the wool blanket a shock against her cheek. Then it all came back. The stagecoach, the unnerving silence of the man, the oppressive smallness of the cabin. A wave of despair washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. But then another feeling rose to meet it, a stubborn, flickering ember of will. She had not come this far only to be crushed. She would not be a burden. She would earn her keep. She rose quietly, her bare feet shrinking from the cold floorboards. She dressed in the near darkness, pulling on her plainest wool dress. She crept into the main room. Eli Hartley was still asleep in his bed, a large, still form under a heavy blanket. She tiptoed past him to the great black stove. Back home, there had been servants to manage such things. She had never once in her life had to build a fire. She looked at the wood box, the kindling, the iron monster of the stove itself. She opened the grate and began clumsily placing small pieces of wood inside, as she'd seen her father's groundskeeper do once, years ago. She was clumsy, her bruised hands stiff and aching in the cold. She dropped a piece of kindling, and it clattered loudly on the floor. In the corner, the form in the bed stirred. Eli sat up, his movements economical and quiet. He watched her for a moment in the dim, gray light filtering through the snow-caked window. She froze, mortified, feeling like a child caught doing something forbidden. "The flue needs to be open," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. He swung his legs out of bed, already dressed in his trousers and undershirt. He came over to the stove, and she instinctively took a step back. He did not seem to notice. He reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder, and pulled a lever on the stovepipe. Then he took the kindling from her, arranged it with practiced ease, and struck a match. A small flame caught, then grew, licking at the dry wood. "You have to let the air in," he explained, his tone matter-of-fact, not condescending, "or it'll just smoke you out." "I'm sorry," she whispered, staring at the floor. "I was only trying to help." "I know," he said. He straightened up and looked at her. In the growing light from the fire and the window, he could see the dark circles under her eyes, the drawn look of her face. There was a gentleness in the lines of her mouth, a softness that seemed at odds with the terror he saw lurking in her gaze. It was that look, that haunted, hunted expression, that unsettled him more than her fine clothes or her bruised hands. It was the look of a soul with no safe harbor, and he had a sinking feeling he had just brought the storm right into his home. The days settled into a quiet, rhythmic pattern, dictated by the needs of survival and the falling snow. Cora, though she was a creature of parlors and paved streets, did not shy from the work. She insisted on helping. Eli would find her in the mornings, already bundled in his oversized coat, her face pale but determined in the frigid air as she followed him to the small, sturdy barn. He showed her how to measure out the feed for his 2 horses and the milk cow, how the animals would nudge her gently for the offering, their warm breath pluming in the cold. At first, she flinched from their size, their sheer animal presence, but soon she learned their quiet language, her movements becoming less fearful, more assured. He taught her how to chop kindling, a task for which she was hopelessly ill-suited. Her hands, still tender and bruised, could barely grip the axe handle. He would watch her for a moment as she struggled to split a small log, her entire body straining with the effort. Then, without a word, he would take the axe from her. His hands would close over hers for a brief, impersonal second as he took the tool. He would split a dozen pieces with a few effortless swings, the sharp crack of the wood echoing in the frozen silence. He never admonished her for her weakness. He simply did the task and left the pile of freshly cut wood for her to carry inside. It was a silent, practical kind of partnership. Inside the cabin, she found her element. She took over the mending, her needle flying with a speed and precision that mesmerized him. She darned his socks, patched a tear in his canvas trousers, and reinforced the seams of his flannel shirts with tiny, perfect stitches. She was a creator of order in their small, rough world. She would sit for hours by the fire, her head bent over her work, the firelight catching the soft brown of her hair. Eli would sit across the room, cleaning a rifle or carving a piece of wood, and he would watch her. He learned the line of her jaw when she was concentrating, the way she would sometimes bite her lower lip. He learned that in these moments of quiet industry, the hunted look would leave her eyes, replaced by a deep and placid focus. Then the big storm came. It was not like the gentle, steady snowfall of the previous days. This was a blizzard, a howling white monster that descended from the mountains without warning. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the cabin, trying to find a way in. Snow came down, not in flakes, but in a solid, blinding sheet, erasing the world outside their window. For 3 days, they were prisoners. The world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, and the silence that had been a vast space between them now became a thick, palpable presence, pressing in on them from all sides. By the 2nd day, the cold began to win. The woodpile, which had seemed so robust, dwindled at an alarming rate. They burned it sparingly, but the fire in the stone hearth seemed to be losing its battle against the storm. The wind found every tiny chink in the log walls, sending icy drafts snaking across the floor. Soon, the cabin grew so cold that their breath began to mist in the air, little ghosts of their own life force dissipating in the gloom. The windows were completely caked over with ice, sealing them in a frigid tomb. Eli worked tirelessly to fight the cold. He stuffed rags into the cracks around the doorframe and the window. He tried to build a bigger fire, but a vicious downdraft, caused by the howling gale outside, sent puffs of acrid smoke billowing back down the chimney, choking them and making their eyes water. After one particularly nasty plume filled the room, he gave up, banking the fire to a sullen, sulking glow that offered more light than warmth. Defeated, he pulled the heavy blankets from both their beds. "We'll have to sit close to the hearth," he said, his voice grim. He laid one blanket on the floor before the meager fire and draped the other over a chair. They huddled there, each wrapped in a separate cocoon of wool, a yard of icy air between them. It was an awkward, miserable truce with the elements. They sat for hours, not speaking, listening to the symphony of the storm. The proximity was a strange kind of torture. Eli was acutely aware of her, of the small, shivering form beside him. He could smell the faint, clean scent of the soap she used, a scent that was utterly foreign in his world of wood smoke and leather. He kept his eyes fixed on the fire, his jaw tight. Cora was just as aware of him. He was a mountain of a man, solid and broad-shouldered, yet he made himself small, careful not to encroach on her space. She noticed the way he angled his body away from her, giving her as much room as the small hearth would allow. She watched his hands, large and calloused, resting on his knees. They were capable hands, hands that could build a cabin or gentle a horse, but they were held perfectly still, as if he were afraid they might betray him. In the evenings, the ritual of changing for the night became a study in strained modesty. The fire was the only source of warmth, however pitiful, and it was the only place to stand. Cora would turn her back, her movements stiff, and untie her laces. She could feel his gaze deliberately avert, could hear the subtle shift of his weight as he turned to face the stone wall of the fireplace, granting her a privacy that their cramped quarters denied. He would not look at her until she was fully wrapped in her nightdress and had scurried into her cold bed. The gesture was one of deep, unspoken respect, and it was so profoundly different from the life she had known that it lodged in her chest like a strange, warm stone. She would lie in the darkness, wrapped in her blankets, feeling the weight of his consideration, and wonder at this quiet, honorable man. On the third night of the storm, the cold was at its worst. It was a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to have settled into their very bones. Cora's hands were numb, her fingers stiff and uncooperative. She stood with her back to the fire, trying to undo the laces on the back of her dress, but her fingers trembled too much. The small ribbon felt slick and impossible between her clumsy thumbs. She fumbled with the knot, her frustration mounting, tears of cold and helplessness welling in her eyes. She did not want to ask. Asking for help was an invitation, an admission of weakness that her past had taught her was dangerous. But the cold was relentless, and she was so tired. She took a shaky breath. "Mr. Hartley?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. He had been staring into the embers, lost in his own thoughts. He turned his head slowly. "Eli," he said. It was not a command, just a quiet correction. "Eli," she repeated, testing the name. I cannot seem to manage my laces. My hands are too cold." He was silent for a long moment. She saw the hesitation in the set of his shoulders, the conflict in his eyes. He looked from her face to her back, and a muscle worked in his jaw. She thought he would refuse, and a part of her, the part that was conditioned to expect rejection, was relieved. But then he rose. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if approaching a frightened deer. He did not come to stand behind her, looming over her. Instead, he knelt on the floor. The gesture was one of deference, of service, and it took her breath away. He was now below her eye level, a large man making himself small for her sake. "Hold still," he murmured, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. His fingers, when they touched the small of her back, were surprisingly gentle. They were rough, the calluses catching for a moment on the fine wool of her dress. But his touch was light, careful. He worked at the knot with a focused patience, his breathing slow and steady. She could feel the warmth of him, even through the layers of her clothing. It was a clean, solid warmth, like that of sun-baked earth. She stood perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, her own breath caught in her throat. She was waiting for the grip to tighten, for the touch to turn possessive, for the whispered word to become a demand. But it never came. His fingers finally loosened the knot, and he began to pull the ribbon through the eyelets, slowly, methodically. The cool air touched her skin as the dress loosened. The intimacy of the act was staggering, more profound than any kiss she had ever received. It was an act of pure, untainted help. She felt a sudden, fierce need to break the silence, to bridge the gap of his careful distance. She turned her head slightly, looking down at the dark crown of his head. "Do not be afraid of me," she whispered. He paused his work, his hands stilling on the ribbon. He did not look up, but she saw his knuckles whiten. He finished his task, pulling the lace completely free. Then he rose to his feet and stepped back, putting the space between them once more. "Your dress is undone," he said, his voice hoarse. He immediately turned his back, facing the fire, presenting her with his rigid, unmoving shoulders. That night, sleep was a distant country neither of them could reach. They lay in their separate, freezing beds, the wind howling its lonely song outside. But for the first time, it was not the cold or the storm that kept them awake. It was the memory of a kneeling man, of calloused fingers on a delicate ribbon, of a whispered plea. The air in the cabin was no longer empty. It was thick with a fragile, terrifying, and unspoken tension. In a mind collapse, the simple exchange hung in the air between them. They had offered each other a piece of their brokenness, a shard of their past. It was not a cure, not a mending, but it was a beginning. Outside, the blizzard had finally exhausted itself. The wind had died down to a low murmur, and a profound silence had fallen over the snow-covered world. Inside the cabin, for the first time, the silence did not feel like an absence, but like a shared and peaceful space. The quiet truce they had reached with the storm was a fragile thing, and it did not last. The blizzard had not passed. It had merely retreated to gather its strength. On the 5th day of their confinement, it returned with a renewed and terrifying fury. The wind no longer moaned, it screamed, a high, thin sound of pure malice that seemed to claw at the very logs of the cabin. Snow drove against the window pane not like flakes, but like handfuls of thrown sand, a relentless, abrasive assault. The world outside was gone, replaced by a churning vortex of white. Sometime in the deep of the afternoon, Eli heard a new sound, a groaning, splintering crack from the direction of the well. He pulled on his coat and boots, wrapped a rope around his waist, and secured the other end to an iron hook by the door. He had to fight the door open against the force of the wind, and when he stepped outside, he was swallowed. The cold was a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. He followed the second rope he had strung between the cabin and the well, his lifeline in the whiteout. The wooden housing over the well had been shattered, torn apart by the wind, and the pulley mechanism was a twisted wreck, choked with ice and snow. The bucket and its rope were gone, likely hurled somewhere into the woods. They had lost their water. He returned to the cabin, shaking snow from his coat, his beard stiff with ice. Cora looked up from her mending, her eyes wide with question. "The well is gone," he said, his voice flat. "The wind took it." He saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but she quickly masked it. "What will we do?" "The same thing the animals do," he said, grabbing the largest cook pot. "We drink the snow." The work was brutal and unending. Every hour, he had to brave the storm, scooping pot after pot of snow from the drifts near the cabin door. a task that left him breathless and numb. He kept the fire roaring, feeding it their precious wood, a constant cycle of melting and boiling. The cabin was filled with steam, the air thick and damp, but it was a world away from the lethal cold just outside the door. This new crisis forged a new rhythm. He was the provider, the fighter of the storm. She was the keeper of the hearth, tending the melted water, ensuring it was boiled and safe, carefully rationing their dwindling food. The space between them, once a chasm of silence, was now filled with the shared purpose of survival. It was on the second day of melting snow that he noticed the change in her. It began with a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. He saw it as she reached for the water ladle, a fine tremor that ran through her shoulders. Later, he heard her cough, a small, dry sound she tried to smother in her handkerchief. She insisted she was fine, that it was just the smoke from the fire, but her cheeks were unnaturally flushed, and her eyes had a glassy, feverish sheen. By morning, she could not hide it. A deep, racking cough shook her small frame, and she could barely stand. When he pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, the heat he felt was alarming. She was burning up. "You need to be in bed," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I am a burden," she whispered, her voice hoarse, her eyes filling with tears of frustration. "Being sick is not a choice," he said gruffly. "Being a fool is get into bed." He helped her to her small room, and she collapsed onto the cot, pulling the patchwork quilt around her shivering body. A deep sense of dread settled in Eli's gut. Redemption. Gulch had no doctor. The nearest one was in a town a week's ride away, an impossible distance even in good weather. In this blizzard, it might as well have been on the moon. He was on his own. She was on his own. The following days became a blur of desperate care. Eli's world shrank to the needs of the woman in the cot. He fought a two-front war, one against the storm that still raged outside, and one against the fever that was consuming Cora from within. He melted snow, kept the fire lit, and forced himself to eat to keep his own strength up. He remembered things his mother had done, things he had learned from Ute traders years ago. He went to his small store of dried goods and found the herbs he kept for the winter: yarrow for the fever, mullein for the cough. He boiled them into a bitter, steaming tea and coaxed her to drink it, lifting her head gently, holding the cup to her pale, cracked lips. She drifted in and out of consciousness. He sat by her side, wiping her face and neck with cloths dipped in cool snowmelt. Her skin was frighteningly hot to the touch. He changed the cloths again and again, a steady, rhythmic ritual in the dim, sick-room light. At times, the shivering would become so violent he feared she might break. In those moments, he would chafe her hands and feet, trying to rub some warmth back into her icy limbs. His large, rough hands moved over her skin with a practiced gentleness he normally reserved for newborn calves. He worked with a singular, desperate focus, his mind a quiet litany of prayers to a God he was not even sure he believed in. In her delirium, she talked. Her words were a jumbled stream of memories and fears, disjointed fragments of a life he could not imagine. She spoke of flowers, of a garden with roses, of the scent of lavender and the feel of silk. Then, the memories would turn dark. Her voice would become tight with fear, her words hushed and pleading. "No, please, do not. I did as you asked." Eli sat on the small stool beside her bed, his head in his hands, and listened. It felt like a monstrous violation, hearing the secrets of her soul laid bare by the fever. He was a man who valued privacy above all else, and he felt like a thief, but he could not leave her side. On the third night of her illness, as the storm outside finally began to abate, she grew more restless. She tossed her head back and forth on the pillow, her hands clutching at the quilt. Her breathing was shallow, her brow furrowed in a tormented dream, and then she said the name. "Julian," she moaned, the name a raw, pleading sound in the quiet cabin. "Julian, I beg you." Eli went rigid. The name struck him like a physical blow. Julian. So, there was a name for the ghost that haunted her eyes. He felt a surge of something hot and dark in his chest, an ancient, primitive anger. His jaw tightened until his teeth ached. He looked at the woman lying helpless in the bed, and he wanted to find this Julian, this man who had put such a broken sound in her voice, and he wanted to tear him apart with his bare hands. The fever broke just before dawn. He was changing the cloth on her forehead when he felt it, the slightest film of moisture on her skin. The terrible, dry heat was receding. Her breathing deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of true sleep. A wave of relief so profound it made his knees weak washed over him. He sank onto the stool, his body trembling with exhaustion, and watched her sleep as the first pale, gray light of morning crept through the ice-caked window. She woke late in the afternoon. Her eyes, when they opened, were clear for the first time in days. They were also filled with a deep and terrible shame. She looked at him, sitting by her bed, his face haggard with sleeplessness. "I am sorry," she whispered, her voice a raw thread of sound. "For what?" he asked. "You were sick." I spoke," she said, her gaze falling. "In my fever." Eli said nothing. He simply looked at her, his expression unreadable. Her eyes filled with tears. "He is dead," she whispered, as if the words themselves were a penance. She would not look at him, her gaze fixed on a loose thread in the quilt. "My husband, Julian, he is dead. He broke me before he left." The confession, so stark and unadorned, hung in the air between them. It answered 100 questions and asked 1,000 more. Eli saw the long, dark road of her past stretching out behind her, a path of pain and fear. He could see the shape of the man named Julian, a shadow that had tried to extinguish the light in her. Every instinct he had was to ask, to know, to understand the full measure of what had been done to her. But he looked at her face, at the fragile terror in her eyes, and he knew that questions were the last thing she needed. She did not need an interrogator. She needed a safe harbor. He reached out, his movements slow and deliberate, and gently took her hand. It was frail and cool in his. Then he did something that surprised them both. He slid his other arm beneath her shoulders and carefully, gently, drew her into a half-embrace. He cradled her against his chest, her head resting on his shoulder. She was so light, she felt like a bird in his arms. She went stiff for a moment, her entire body rigid with shock and reflexive fear. He held her steady, not tightening his grip, simply offering his solid, unwavering presence, and then, slowly, tentatively, she relaxed. A shudder ran through her, a deep, cathartic sigh, and she leaned into his warmth. For the first time, she did not flinch from his touch. She accepted it. She rested in it. He held her for a long time, saying nothing, simply listening to the sound of her breathing as she cried, soft and silent, against his shirt. The days that followed were a quiet world of healing. The blizzard was over, leaving behind a landscape of impossible, breathtaking beauty, a world sculpted in white and silence. Inside the cabin, a different kind of peace settled. Cora slowly regained her strength. Eli cooked for her, simple broths and soft bread, and he watched with quiet satisfaction as the color returned to her cheeks. The wall between them, breached by her illness and his care, seemed to have dissolved. The silence was no longer heavy with unspoken things. It was a comfortable, shared space. To pass the long hours, he started reading to her. He had only a few books, a worn Bible, a copy of Shakespeare's tragedies that had belonged to his mother, and a stack of old newspapers and almanacs. He would sit in the chair by her bed, his voice a low, steady rumble as he read articles about crop prices in the East, stories of steamships crossing the ocean, or the dense, poetic lines of a play he barely understood himself. Cora would listen, her eyes closed, a small smile playing on her lips. The sound of his voice was a balm, a steady presence that chased away the last of the fever's shadows. One morning, nearly a week after the fever had broken, he came into the main room to find her sitting on the floor by the hearth. She was dressed, and she was brushing her hair. The long, dark strands, washed and clean, cascaded over her shoulders. The firelight glowed behind her, creating a halo around her head, turning the edges of her hair to spun gold. She moved the brush in long, slow, rhythmic strokes. It was a simple, domestic act. Yet to Eli, it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. It was a sign of life, of recovery, of a woman reclaiming herself. She must have felt his gaze, because she paused, the brush held in mid-air. She turned and looked at him, her eyes clear and direct. For the first time, the hunted look was entirely gone. She saw the way he was watching her, the unguarded look of wonder on his face. "Do you still see a broken woman?" she asked, her voice soft, but with a new, quiet strength. Eli was not a man of pretty words. His heart was a locked chest, and he had long ago lost the key. But he looked at her now, at the resilience in her posture, at the courage in her eyes, and the truth came to him, simple and unadorned. He shook his head slowly. "No," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "I see a woman still standing." A slow, genuine smile spread across her face, transforming her. It was the first time he had truly seen her smile, and it was like the sun breaking through after a long winter. That night, the cold returned, and they built up the fire, laying their blankets on the floor before it as they had during the storm. But this time, they did not keep a careful distance. They lay on their separate blankets, but they were close enough to feel each other's warmth. They talked for hours, their voices low murmurs in the fire-lit darkness. He told her about growing up in the mining camps, about the dust and the danger, about the fierce loyalty between the men who went underground each day. She told him about her mother's house, about the quiet afternoons spent reading in the garden, about a life that felt like it had belonged to someone else entirely. The fire burned down to glowing orange embers. The wind whispered around the corners of the cabin, a lonely, gentle sound. The world was asleep in the warm, flickering silence. Cora rolled onto her side to face him. He watched her, his heart suddenly beating a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. She reached out her hand, her fingers tracing the air between them for a moment before they settled on his. Her touch was hesitant, yet deliberate. She took his large, calloused hand and, with a solemn grace, brought it to her chest. She placed it flat over her heart, right over the simple wool of her nightdress. He could feel the steady, rhythmic beat of her life against his palm. It was a gesture of profound and terrifying trust. She looked directly into his eyes, and the firelight reflected in their depths. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely audible over the crackle of the embers. "Touch me like you mean it," she whispered. It was a plea, a challenge, and an invitation all at once. It was not a request for passion, but for presence, for honesty, for a touch that was not a prelude to pain or a claim of ownership. A touch that saw her, the woman still standing. He leaned in, his mind shutting down, his body acting on a need so deep he had not known it existed. He kissed her. It was a slow, careful exploration. A question asked without words. Her lips were soft, tentative under his. It was a kiss of shared solitude and newfound hope. It tasted of wood smoke and sorrow and the faintest promise of spring. He felt her respond. A small, quiet sigh, a yielding. And in that yielding, he felt a sudden, sharp fear. A fear of his own rough nature, of the darkness he carried within himself. A fear of breaking this fragile, precious thing he held in his hands. He pulled back, putting a few inches of space between them. He rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. She opened her eyes. She did not look hurt or rejected. She looked at him with a deep and quiet wisdom. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. She understood his hesitation. She understood his fear. But in the depths of her gray eyes, a silent plea remained, a yearning that mirrored his own. The morning after the kiss was a world remade. The light that slanted through the newly cleared window seemed softer, the air in the cabin less heavy. A fragile, unspoken thing had been born in the firelight, and now, in the quiet of the day, neither of them knew quite what to do with it. An awkwardness settled between them, a shyness that had not existed even in their initial silence. They moved around each other with a new and careful awareness, their hands sometimes brushing as they reached for the same pot or utensil, sending a jolt of heat through the space between them. The change began with a smile. Cora was kneading dough for bread, a task she had taken to with a surprising aptitude. A dusting of flour settled on her nose, a perfect white smudge on her pale skin. Eli, watching her from the table where he was oiling a piece of tack, felt an unfamiliar twitch at the corner of his mouth. "You have a little something," he said, his voice a low rumble. She looked up, confused, and touched her cheek. "Here?" "No," he said, the twitch growing stronger. "On your nose." She rubbed her nose with the back of her floured hand, succeeding only in spreading the white powder across her cheek. She looked so earnest, so completely unaware of how charmingly foolish she appeared, that a sound erupted from Eli's chest that he did not recognize. It was a laugh, not a chuckle, but a deep, unpracticed bark of genuine amusement. It was a rusty, creaking sound, as if a piece of machinery long left to the elements had suddenly been forced into motion. The sound startled them both. He stopped abruptly, looking almost ashamed. But Cora, after a moment of surprise, began to smile. It was not the small, hesitant smile he had seen before. This was a full, radiant thing that lit up her entire face, reaching her storm-gray eyes and turning them the color of a clearing sky. And seeing her smile like that, he laughed again, a little more freely this time. The sound filled the small cabin, chasing the last of the shadows from the corners. A barrier had been broken, not with words, but with a shared, simple moment of levity. The days that followed were lighter. The heavy weight of their pasts seemed, for a time, to have been set down. They talked more, their conversations weaving from the practical to the personal. He learned that her favorite color was the deep blue of twilight, and she learned that he preferred the sharp, clean scent of pine over any other. These were small, inconsequential things, yet they felt like precious gifts, pieces of themselves offered up in the quiet safety of their isolated world. One afternoon, as she was tidying the cabin, a task that she performed with a relentless, calming energy, she began to hum. It was a simple, lilting melody, a tune from a life long past. Eli stopped his work, listening. The sound was like a small, brave flower pushing its way up through the snow. He watched her sway slightly in time with the music she was making, her movements graceful and unself-conscious. An impulse, so foreign and startling that he almost dismissed it, seized him. He put down the harness he was mending and stood. "What is that tune?" he asked. She stopped, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "Oh, it is nothing. Just a waltz my mother used to play on the pianoforte." He crossed the small room in 3 long strides and stood before her. He held out his hand, his large, calloused palm upturned. "Will you show me?" She stared at his hand as if it were a strange and exotic object. I do not know how to lead," she stammered. "That is all right," he said, his voice gentle. "I do." Hesitantly, she placed her small, slender hand in his. Her fingers were cool against his skin. He drew her to the center of the room, into the patch of pale winter sunlight falling on the floorboards. He put his other hand on the small of her back, his touch careful, respectful. She rested her free hand on his shoulder, her touch as light as a moth's wing. And they danced. It was a clumsy, halting affair. He was a man built for felling trees and breaking horses, not for the refined steps of a waltz. His boots were heavy on the floor, and their movements were more of a shuffle than a graceful turn. They bumped into the table, nearly knocked over a chair, but they laughed, their quiet laughter mingling with the sound of her humming as she picked up the tune again. He held her a little closer, and she did not pull away. In the middle of the snowbound wilderness, in the heart of a rough-hewn cabin, they turned and shuffled, two lonely souls finding a clumsy, shared rhythm. For a few precious moments, they were not a solitary rancher and a mail-order bride. They were just a man and a woman, held together by a simple, wordless song. The next day, he decided it was time. The world outside was still a place of danger. Wolves and mountain lions roamed the forests, and desperate men sometimes drifted through the high country. She needed to be able to protect herself. He took down the old Winchester rifle that had belonged to his father. It was smaller and lighter than his own hunting rifle. He brought it outside, into the blinding white of the snow-covered clearing. "Every person in this country should know how to use one of these," he said, his tone practical. "All business." Cora looked at the rifle with a deep apprehension. The sight of it, the cold gleam of the barrel, reminded her of a violence she had spent her life trying to escape. "I have never held a firearm before," she said, her voice small. "I will show you," he said patiently. He explained the mechanism, how to load the cartridge, how to work the lever action, how to sight down the barrel. His voice was calm, methodical, stripping the weapon of its menace and turning it into a simple tool. Then, he handed it to her. The weight of it surprised her, a solid, heavy reality in her hands. She held it awkwardly, her shoulders tense. "Bring it up to your shoulder," he instructed. "Tuck it in tight. If you hold it loose, the kick will bruise you something fierce." He stepped behind her, his presence a warm, solid wall at her back. He reached around, his hands covering hers, adjusting her grip on the stock and the forestock. "Like this," he murmured, his breath stirring the hair at her temple. His body was pressed against hers, a firm, guiding pressure. She could feel the hard muscles of his chest against her shoulder blades. Her heart began to beat a little faster, but for the first time in her life, the proximity of a man did not trigger a ripple of fear. It felt safe. It felt like an anchor. He helped her aim at an old stump at the edge of the clearing. "Breathe out slow," he said, his voice a low rumble right beside her ear, "and squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." She closed her eyes for a second, took a shaky breath, and squeezed. The rifle roared. The sound a shocking explosion in the pristine silence. The kick, even with her holding it tight, was a solid punch to her shoulder, and she stumbled back a step, right into him. His hands were instantly on her arms, steadying her. "You all right?" She nodded, her ears ringing, her eyes wide. She had missed the stump by a good 3 feet, the bullet kicking up a puff of snow far to the left. "Again," he said. They spent the next hour like that. He stood with her, correcting her stance, guiding her aim, his patient voice a constant presence. Slowly, her fear of the weapon was replaced by a focused concentration. And finally, a shot rang out, and a chip of bark flew from the side of the stump. A small cry of triumph escaped her lips. She turned to him, her face alight with a fierce, unfamiliar pride. "I did it," he smiled, a slow, genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I knew you could," he said. Later that afternoon, the easy warmth that had grown between them was shattered. They were inside, the comforting smell of coffee filling the cabin. Cora was standing by the hearth, warming her hands, her back to the room. Eli crossed the floor to add another log to the fire. As he passed behind her, he did what felt, in that moment, like the most natural thing in the world. He reached out and rested his hand on her shoulder, a simple, companionable touch. She screamed. It was not a loud sound, more of a choked, strangled cry, but it was filled with pure, undiluted terror. Her entire body went rigid, and she flinched away from his touch so violently that she nearly fell into the fire. She scrambled to the other side of the room, pressing herself into the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes wide and wild. The smile was gone. The light was gone. In their place was the old, familiar shadow. She was the terrified creature from the stagecoach all over again. Eli froze, his hands still outstretched. The warmth in the cabin seemed to be sucked out, replaced by a sudden, glacial cold. He felt as if he had been slapped. He stared at her, huddled in the corner, her body trembling, and he did not understand. The touch had been gentle, affectionate. He had meant only to offer comfort, connection. He had not expected this. "Cora," he said, his voice rough with shock. She did not answer. She just stared at him, her breath coming in ragged gasps. He saw it then, in her eyes. She was not seeing him. She was seeing someone else. She was seeing the ghost named Julian. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Eli slowly lowered his hand. The easy camaraderie of the past few days felt like a dream, a cruel illusion. The reality was this: a terrified woman in his cabin, and a wound so deep he could not even begin to comprehend its source. He did not press her. He gave her space, moving to the other side of the room and sitting heavily at the table. The hours passed in a strained, miserable silence. The sun began to set, painting the snow outside in hues of pink and purple, but inside the cabin, the light felt gray and cold. Finally, as darkness fell completely, he could not bear it any longer. He rose and lit a lamp, the soft yellow light pushing back the gloom. He walked over to where she still stood, though she was no longer pressed into the corner. She stood by the window, staring out at the night. He stopped a few feet away from her, careful not to crowd her. "Cora," he said again, his voice softer this time. "Please, talk to me." She turned from the window, her face pale and tear-streaked in the lamplight. She looked at him, and he saw a war being fought in her eyes. A battle between the instinct to hide and a desperate need to be seen. "It was not you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It was never you." "Then what was it?" he asked gently. She took a shuddering breath. "A touch, sometimes. A touch is a memory." She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. He waited, his patience a quiet, solid thing in the room. He knew, with an unshakable certainty, that this was a precipice. They could either step back from it into the silence, or she could choose to leap. When she looked up again, her resolve had hardened. "Julian was not just cruel with his words, or with his fists," she said, her voice low and flat, stripped of all emotion. "He was a man who believed in ownership. He wanted to mark what was his." Eli's blood ran cold. He did not understand. Not fully, but the word mark sent a chill of horror through him. Cora's hand went to the collar of her dress. Her fingers trembled as she undid the top 2 buttons. With a deep, shuddering breath, she pulled the fabric aside, exposing the pale, delicate skin just beneath her collarbone. And he saw it. It was not a cut, not a bruise. It was a scar, old and white, but unmistakable in its design. A small, ornate letter J. He had seen marks like it before, on the hides of cattle. He was looking at a brand. The sight of it, on her skin, was an obscenity. It was a desecration, a profound and unspeakable act of cruelty that went beyond simple violence into something far more twisted. A wave of black, murderous rage washed over Eli, so powerful it made him dizzy. He felt the old bloodlust stir in him, the same cold fire he had felt on that night with the horse thieves. He wanted to find Julian's grave and dig him up, just to have a body to destroy. He must have made a sound, a low growl in the back of his throat, because she quickly covered the mark, her eyes filled with a fresh wave of fear. "Please," she whispered, "do not look at me with such hate." He reined himself in, forcing the rage down, banking it like a dangerous fire. He looked at her face, at the shame and terror there, and his anger was replaced by a vast, aching sorrow. He was silent for a long, long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and her quiet, ragged breathing. He thought of his own past, of the blood on his hands, of the darkness he had locked away. He had always thought of his scars as a punishment, a mark of his own guilt. But looking at her, He saw something else, in a trembling act of trust, a confession to match her own. He turned his back to the lamp and began to unbutton his own flannel shirt. He pulled it off, letting it fall to the floor. Then he turned back to face her. His torso and shoulders were a roadmap of a violent life. There were several old scars, thin and white, from knife wounds sustained in a saloon brawl years ago. And across his ribs, a thicker, angrier scar from where a rustler's bullet had grazed him. They were ugly marks, proof of his own failings, of his own participation in the world's brutality. He saw her eyes trace the lines on his skin. Her expression was one of shock, of dawning comprehension. "We have both been carved," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "But we are not the cuts." He stepped closer, into the space she had so fiercely protected. He reached out, not for her shoulder, but for her hand. He took it in his thumb gently stroking her bruised knuckles. He looked into her eyes, and she looked into his. In that moment, they saw each other. Not the mail-order bride and the solitary rancher, not the victim and the vigilante. They saw two survivors, two scarred and broken souls who had somehow found each other in the heart of a blizzard. He leaned in and kissed her again. This kiss was different. It was not the hesitant, questioning kiss of before. This was a kiss of profound acceptance, of shared pain and fierce, defiant survival. It was deep and sure, a claiming and a surrendering all at once. Her other hand came up, not to push him away, but to cup his jaw. Her fingers spread, guiding him, deepening the kiss. She was no longer a passive recipient. She was an active participant, meeting his intensity with her own. The heat between them, once a fragile spark, now ignited, a wildfire of emotion and long-suppressed desire. He lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing and carried her to the blankets before the fire. He laid her down gently, his eyes never leaving hers. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, soft, silent flakes against the window pane. But inside, a different kind of storm was building. Blankets shifted in the firelight. They made love. It was slow, raw, and haltingly tender. It was a language of touch, a conversation between their scars. Every caress was a question, every response a reassurance. He was clumsy, his hands more used to leather reins than soft skin, but he moved with an infinite, reverent patience, learning the lines of her body, discovering what brought a soft gasp to her lips, what made her arch against him in trust instead of fear. And she, in turn, was a student of his own battered landscape, her fingers tracing the old wounds on his back, her touch not one of pity, but of profound, healing acceptance. It was an act of mending, of two broken halves fitting together to make a fragile, imperfect whole. Afterward, as the fire burned down to glowing embers, they lay tangled in the blankets, their bodies slick with sweat, the air thick with the scent of their union. She curled into his chest, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder, her hand spread flat over his heart. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, protecting her from a world that had only ever tried to break her. They lay in silence for a long time, listening to the gentle hiss of the falling snow. Then she spoke, her voice a sleepy, contented whisper against his skin. "That was the first time," she said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "That was the first time I did not feel afraid. The first true sign of spring was not warmth, but water." It began as a whisper, a gentle, persistent dripping from the eaves of the cabin as the midday sun gained a sliver of strength. Soon, the whisper became a chorus. Meltwater began to run in tiny, brave rivulets down the hillsides, carving dark, urgent lines in the monolithic white. The world, for months held in a state of suspended animation, began to stir. Patches of rich, brown earth appeared on the sun-facing slopes like bruises on the white skin of the snow. The air, though still sharp, carried a new scent on the breeze, the smell of damp soil, of thawing pine, of life returning. Inside the cabin, The changing season was mirrored by a quiet, settled peace. The raw, desperate passion of their first union had softened into a gentle, domestic rhythm. They moved around each other with an easy familiarity, their lives intertwined in the simple, shared tasks of survival. A touch was no longer a thing of fear or prelude, but a casual, comforting language. His hand would find the small of her back as he passed her by the stove. Her fingers would briefly rest on his arm as she handed him a cup of coffee. They were small gestures, but they were the mortar holding their new world together. He taught her how to set snares for rabbits, and she taught him the words to the waltzes her mother used to play. The sound of her humming was now a constant, gentle undercurrent in the cabin, and the rare, rusty sound of his laughter was heard more and more. The scars they both carried had not vanished, but they had ceased to be the defining feature of their landscape. They were simply a part of the terrain they had learned to navigate together. Their world was small, perfect, and sealed off from the one that had hurt them. The puncture came on a bright, cold afternoon in the form of a man on a tired horse. He was a trapper heading down from the high country, the first human being either of them had seen in months. He brought them news from town and tied in an oilskin pouch to protect it from the wet. A single piece of mail. The letter had been waiting at the post office in Redemption Gulch for weeks, waiting for the past to be clear enough for someone to make the journey. The moment Eli saw the fine, elegant script on the envelope, a cold knot of dread formed in his stomach. The letter was addressed to Mrs. Julian Whitmore. He took it inside and handed it to Cora. She was by the fire, mending one of his shirts, a look of quiet contentment on her face. When she saw the handwriting, that look vanished, extinguished as if by a sudden, cruel wind. The color drained from her face, leaving it a stark, waxy white. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the letter rattled between her fingers. She was no longer the woman who could hit a stump with a rifle, who could laugh with flour on her nose. She was, once again, the haunted creature who had stepped off the stagecoach. Her fingers, stiff and uncooperative, tore at the seal. She read the single sheet of paper, her eyes flying across the lines. Eli watched as her expression shifted from fear to a kind of dull, resigned horror. The letter dropped from her nerveless fingers and fluttered to the floor. "He knows where I am," she whispered, her voice a dead thing. Eli picked up the letter. The words were couched in the language of polite society, but their meaning was as brutal as a cudgel. It was from a man named Thomas Whitmore, Julian's elder brother. He wrote of his deep concern for his sister-in-law's welfare, of the scandal her sudden disappearance had caused. He informed her that he felt it was his family duty to assume responsibility for her, and that he would be arriving in the West shortly to retrieve her and bring her back to Philadelphia, where she belonged. The final line was a masterpiece of veiled threat. "I am certain you will wish to avoid any public unpleasantness. A quiet, voluntary return would be best for all concerned, especially for the preservation of what remains of your reputation." "He will come," Cora said, her gaze distant, her hand instinctively going to the place beneath her collarbone where her scar was hidden. "He will not let me go." "He has no right," Eli snarled, crumpling the letter in his fist. A familiar, cold fire was kindling in his gut. This man, this stranger, was reaching into his home, into his life, trying to steal the one piece of light he had found. "This is your home now. He has no say." "You do not understand," she said, a desperate urgency in her voice. "The Whitmores, they do not lose. They do not allow their possessions to be misplaced. Julian was cruel, but Thomas is relentless. He is the one who manages the family's reputation. I am a loose thread he needs to snip, or a stain he needs to scrub out. He will not stop." The rage in Eli's chest solidified into a hard, cold resolve. "Then I will stop him," he said. "I will ride into town. I will find this man. I will make him understand that he is not welcome here." "No!" she cried, a raw panic in her voice. She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh, You cannot. That is what he wants. He wants a confrontation. He wants to prove that you are an unsuitable guardian, that I am in the hands of a violent backwoodsman. Thomas does not fight with his fists. Eli, he uses whispers, and lawyers, and public opinion. And when that fails, she hesitated, her eyes dark with a terrible knowledge. He kills what he cannot control. The finality in her voice chilled him more than any threat. He looked at her, at the absolute certainty in her eyes, and he knew she was right. His brand of direct, physical justice would not work here. It would only be playing into the man's hands. That night, the easy peace of the cabin was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. They lay in their bed, but they did not touch, each lost in their own dark thoughts. Eli lay awake for hours, his mind racing, trying to find a path through the danger that was descending upon them. He finally drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle he kept by the bed. He awoke with a start, a sudden sense of wrongness pulling him from his dreams. The place beside him was empty. The cabin was dark, save for the faint, silvery light of the moon filtering through the window. He sat up, his heart pounding, and saw her. She was a ghost in the darkness, a shadow moving silently across the room. She was dressed in her old traveling clothes, the ones she had arrived in. Her small satchel was on the table, and she was wrapping a loaf of bread and a piece of dried meat in a cloth. She was preparing to run. The sight of it broke his heart. All their progress, all the trust they had built, was being undone by a ghost from her past. She was reverting to her old instinct, flight. He rose from the bed, his bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. "Where are you going, Cora?" he asked, his voice a quiet rumble in the darkness. She froze, her back to him, her shoulders slumped. "I have to go," she whispered, not turning around. "Before he gets here." "I will not bring this down on you. I will not be the reason you are hurt. Or worse, I have been running my whole life. I know how to disappear." He crossed the room and stood behind her. He did not touch her. "You are right," he said. She flinched, as if he had struck her. She thought he was agreeing, that he was letting her go. "You have been running your whole life," he continued, his voice low and firm. "But you are not running anymore." She slowly turned to face him. Her face was a pale oval in the moonlight, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "This is not Philadelphia," he said, his gaze intense, holding hers. "There are no society pages here. There are no lawyers who can twist the truth. There is only this cabin, and the mountains, and us. This is your home, and I will not let him, or any other man, take you from it." He reached out and gently took the parcel of food from her hands, placing it back on the table. He took her cold fingers in his grip warm and steady. "We will face him together," he said. "Here, on our ground." She stared at him, a war of hope and fear raging in her eyes. The instinct to flee was a powerful, deeply ingrained thing, but the man standing before her, his hand holding hers as if he were holding her very soul, was a more powerful anchor. Her shoulders slumped, not in defeat, but in a kind of weary surrender to hope. She gave a single, shuddering nod. The days that followed were a quiet, grim preparation. The cabin, once their sanctuary, became their fortress. Eli barred the door with a heavy iron beam he normally used for skinning hides. He boarded up the single, vulnerable window, leaving only a narrow slit through which to see and, if necessary, to shoot. The interior of the cabin was plunged into a perpetual twilight, lit only by the fire and a single lamp. They moved furniture, positioning the heavy table to provide cover. The silence returned, but it was not the comfortable silence of before. It was a silence heavy with dread, with the constant, nerve-wracking strain of waiting. They worked as a team. He cleaned and oiled the rifles, showing her again and again how to load and fire, his movements economical, his voice calm. She, in turn, prepared food that did not need cooking, stacked firewood, and filled every available container with water, a lesson learned from the blizzard. They were two soldiers preparing for a siege, their fear a silent, third presence in the room. He arrived 4 days later, just after dawn. Eli saw them first. Through the slit in the boarded-up window, 3 riders, dark silhouettes against the pale morning sky, making their way slowly up the valley. He did not need to be told who they were. "They are here," he said, his voice flat. Cora, who had been sitting by the fire, went rigid. She came to stand beside him, peering through the opening. The man in the lead was tall and dressed in a fine, dark Eastern coat that looked absurdly out of place in the rugged landscape, even from a distance. He carried himself with an air of arrogant authority. The 2 men who flanked him were of a different sort entirely, broad-shouldered and rough-looking, with guns holstered low on their hips. They were not friends, they were hired muscle. The 3 men reined in their horses 100 feet from the cabin. The leader, Thomas Whitmore, dismounted. He was a handsome man, in a cold, sharp-featured way. He looked at the fortified cabin with an expression of disdain, as if he had found a cockroach in his soup. "Cora!" he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. It was a cultivated, powerful voice, used to being obeyed. "This foolishness has gone on long enough. I have come to take you home." Inside the cabin, Cora flinched as if the voice itself were a lash. Eli put a steadying hand on her arm. "Go to your room," he said quietly. "Stay away from the opening." She shook her head, her jaw set with a new, hard resolve. "No, I will not hide." Eli gave her a quick, approving look, then turned his attention back to the men outside. He slid the barrel of his rifle through the slit, the metallic sound loud in the tense silence. "You have business here?" Eli called out, his voice a low growl that was a stark contrast to the other man's refined tones. Thomas Whitmore's eyes narrowed, focusing on the rifle barrel. "My business is with my sister-in-law. This is a family matter. It does not concern you." "Anything that happens on this land concerns me," Eli replied. "Mrs. Whitmore is here by her own choice, and she is staying." A humorless smile touched Thomas's lips. "I see. So you are the rustic hero who has filled her head with these foolish notions of independence. I assure you, she is unwell. Her grief has made her suggestible. She requires the care of her family." "She requires nothing from you," Eli said, his voice dangerously low. "Turn your horses around and ride out of this valley. You are not welcome here." Thomas's polite facade finally cracked. His face hardened, the civility replaced by a cold, reptilian fury. "I have a legal right to assume her guardianship. She is my brother's property, and now, my responsibility. I will not leave without her. You have 2 minutes to send her out, or we will come in and get her." He turned to his men. "Be ready." The 2 hired guns dismounted, their hands hovering near their pistols. The air grew thick, electric. Inside the cabin, Eli felt Cora trembling beside him, but she stood her ground. He knew this was the moment. There would be no more words. "Cora," he said, his voice urgent but calm. "Get down, now." He did not wait for her to obey. He grabbed her and shoved her to the floor behind the overturned table, just as the first shot rang out. The bullet splintered the log wall just inches from where his head had been. A second shot followed, then a third. They were trying to pin him down. Eli returned fire. A single, deliberate shot aimed not at a man, but at the ground near their feet. A final warning. It was ignored. One of the hired men broke from cover, running toward the side of the cabin, trying to get a better angle. Eli swung the rifle. Tracking him, he fired, and the man grunted, stumbling, but did not fall. The fight was on. Gunsmoke filled the small cabin, acrid and choking. Outside, the men shouted, their fire becoming more intense. A bullet pierced the door, whining through the small space. Eli was focused, his mind cold and clear, every movement precise. He was a hunter, and these men were his prey. He levered another round into the chamber. took aim at the second man who was taking cover behind a tree, and was about to fire when a searing, white-hot pain exploded in his left shoulder. He cried out, the force of the impact spinning him around, knocking him back from the wall. The rifle clattered to the floor. He slumped against the logs, his vision swimming, a dark, wet warmth spreading across his chest and back. He had been hit. He heard Cora scream his name. He tried to push himself up, tried to reach for the rifle, but his left arm was useless, a dead weight, and a wave of dizziness washed over him. "Eli!" Cora's voice was thin with terror. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear the men outside, emboldened by his cry of pain, starting to advance on the cabin. It was over. He had failed. Then he saw her. Cora was on her knees, her face a mask of terror, staring at the blood soaking his shirt. But then her gaze shifted to the rifle lying on the floor between them. She looked from the gun to the door, and then back to him, his life leaking out onto the floorboards. A change came over her. The terror was still there, but something else rose to meet it, a fierce, primal resolve. He saw the memory of his teaching flash in her eyes. She crawled across the floor, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip the wooden stock. She picked up the heavy rifle. It was the old Winchester, his father's gun. She pushed herself up into a kneeling position behind the table, the same way he had taught her. She rested the barrel on the edge, the metal clinking against the wood. Outside, one of the hired guns, the one he had missed, was making a rush for the door, his pistol raised. Eli saw the man through a haze of pain. He saw Cora brace herself. He saw her close her eyes for a second, her lips moving in a silent prayer, or perhaps a curse. He heard his own voice, a faint echo in his memory. "Breathe out slow, and squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it." The Winchester roared, the sound deafening inside the small cabin. The kickback sent her sprawling backward. But the shot was true. Outside, the advancing man stopped dead. A look of profound surprise crossed his face. He dropped his pistol, clutched at his chest, and then crumpled to the ground in a heap. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then, from behind the tree, the other hired man cursed loudly, fired one more wild, unaimed shot into the cabin wall, and then ran for his horse. Thomas Whitmore, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, stared for a second at his fallen man, then at the silent, smoking cabin. His nerve broke. He scrambled onto his horse and galloped away, not even bothering to check on the man Cora had shot. The second hired man was right behind him, fleeing the valley as if the devil himself were on their heels. Silence descended, broken only by the sound of retreating hoofbeats and the faint crackle of the fire. Cora lay on the floor, the rifle still clutched in her hands, her body shaking with violent, uncontrollable tremors. The man outside did not move. She finally looked at Eli. He was slumped against the wall, pale but conscious, his hand pressed against his bleeding shoulder. Their eyes met across the smoky, debris-strewn room. She crawled to him, dropping the rifle as if it were a venomous snake. Sobs began to rack her body, deep, tearing sounds of grief and horror. She crumpled against him, burying her face in his good shoulder. "I did not want to be saved like this," she wept, her voice broken, her tears soaking his shirt. "I did not want this." He reached up with his good hand and wrapped it around her, holding her tight. He could feel the fine bones of her shoulders shaking, the terrible, shuddering aftermath of the violence she had been forced to commit. "Cora," he said, his voice weak but clear. "Listen to me." She looked up, her face a mess of tears and smoke stains. "He was going to kill me," he said. "They were going to take you. You did what you had to do." He took a deep, pained breath, his gaze holding hers with a fierce intensity. "I did not save you. You saved yourself." The world outside the cabin was silent, save for the drip of melting snow and the mournful cry of a distant hawk. The bodies were gone. Eli, weak from blood loss but resolute, had directed Cora on how to load the dead man onto his own horse. The other man, the one he had wounded, had managed to get away. They had sent the horse off with a slap on the rump, a grim, riderless messenger heading back towards whatever civilization had spawned them. Then, and only then, had Eli allowed himself to collapse. The roles were now reversed. The patient became the nurse, and the nurse, the patient. Cora, who had once been so helpless, now moved with a quiet, fierce competence. The terror that had locked her limbs in place after the gunshot had receded, replaced by a singular, sharp-edged focus. She would not let him die. She cut away his blood-soaked shirt with a pair of mending shears, her hands surprisingly steady. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his shoulder, a wound that was painful and bloody, but she prayed. Not fatal. She washed it with boiled water, her touch gentle but firm, her stomach churning at the sight of the raw, torn flesh. He gritted his teeth, his face pale and beaded with sweat, but he did not make a sound, his eyes never leaving her face. She packed the wound with the last of the yarrow, the same herb he had used to break her fever, and bound it tightly with strips of a clean bedsheet. The days that followed settled into a new, quiet rhythm, a mirror image of when she had been ill. She was the one who kept the fire going, who cooked the broth, who brought him water. She was the one who sat by his side in the long, quiet hours, changing his dressing, checking for fever, her presence a constant, watchful vigil. In this quiet aftermath, their bond, already forged in the crucible of the blizzard, was tempered into something unbreakable. He was vulnerable now. His formidable strength laid low, and he allowed her to see him in his weakness without shame. She, in turn, blossomed under the weight of his dependence. Tending to him was not a burden. It was a reclamation. Every clean bandage she tied, every spoonful of broth she coaxed him to eat, was an act of defiance against the woman she had once been. She was no longer a possession to be marked and broken. She was a protector, a healer, a woman who had saved a life. He would watch her as she moved about the cabin, her steps now sure and confident. He saw the new strength in the set of her shoulders, the clear, unwavering resolve in her eyes. The haunted look was gone, burned away in the flash of gunpowder. He had fallen in love with a woman still standing. Now he was in awe of the woman who had refused to fall. The outside world intruded a week later. The sheriff from Redemption Gulch, a weary, gray-haired man named Abernathy, rode up to the cabin with a deputy. They had found the riderless horse, and the story the two surviving men had told in town was a wild one. A tale of a savage mountain man and a crazed woman who had ambushed them. Sheriff Abernathy listened patiently as Eli, his arm in a sling, recounted the true version of events, his voice low and steady. He showed the sheriff the letter from Thomas Whitmore. Cora stood beside Eli, her hand resting on his good shoulder, her gaze direct and unafraid. She answered the sheriff's questions about her past, her voice clear and without a trace of hysteria. She did not speak of the brand, but she spoke of Julian's cruelty and Thomas's relentless need for control. Abernathy was a man who had seen much of the West's ugliness, and he knew the scent of a lie. He looked from Eli's honest, pained face to Cora's quiet dignity, and then at the bullet holes that riddled the cabin door. "The man you shot, ma'am," he said, his voice not unkind. His name was Frank Miller, a hired gun out of Cheyenne with a nasty reputation. From the looks of things, and from what I know of men like him, I would call this a clear case of self-defense. He tipped his hat. "You folks have a right to defend your home. I do not think anyone will be bothering you again." But the law's pronouncement was not the final word. News of the gunfight spread through the small communities like wildfire. Carried by trappers and circuit riders, the story became a piece of local lore, twisted and reshaped with each telling. In town, public opinion was a river split around a rock. Some hailed Cora as a hero, a brave woman who had stood up to Eastern bullies, a true daughter of the frontier. They saw her as a testament to the West's spirit of self-reliance. Others, however, whispered a different story. They were the ones who had seen her step off the stagecoach, a frail creature in lace. They could not reconcile that image with the woman who had killed a man. The whispers started in the general store, in the saloon, in the pews on Sunday. The word they used was murderess. They said she was a black widow, a woman with a dark past who had lured a simple rancher into her web and brought violence to his doorstep. They said she was unnatural, unwomanly. The whispers eventually found their way to the cabin, brought by the circuit preacher, a thin, earnest man named Reverend Davies. He arrived one sunny afternoon, his Bible clutched in his hand, his face a mask of pious concern. He sat at their table, accepted a cup of water, and proceeded to explain the delicate situation. "The town is talking. Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his eyes avoiding hers. "Gossip, as you know, is a pernicious weed. They speak of your unconventional living arrangement with Mr. Hartley, a woman of your station, unmarried, living under the roof of a bachelor, and with this terrible business of the shooting, it provides fuel for a fire of speculation." Cora sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, a cold knot of anger tightening in her stomach. After everything she had endured, she was to be judged by the wagging tongues of strangers. "It is for your own protection. You understand," the preacher continued, finally looking at her. "A woman alone is vulnerable, not just to physical harm, but to the ruin of her good name. The best way, the only way, to silence these whispers is to sanctify your union in the eyes of God and the community. I have come to suggest that you and Mr. Hartley marry. For appearance's sake, of course. It would grant you his name, his protection. It would make you an honest woman in the eyes of the town." The word struck Cora with the force of a physical blow. His protection, an honest woman. It was the language of her old life, the language of cages, the idea that she should marry to be shielded, to be made respectable by a man's name, was a profound insult to the woman she had fought so hard to become. She had faced down a killer, saved the life of the man she loved, and now she was being told she needed a marriage certificate to be considered honest. A bitter resentment rose in her, so strong she could taste it. She was about to deliver a sharp, cutting reply when Eli spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Thank you for your concern, Reverend. We will consider your counsel." He showed the preacher out, his face an unreadable mask. When he returned, Cora had risen and was standing by the window, her back to him, her shoulders rigid. The peace of their recovery was shattered. "So that is what I am to you?" she said, her voice tight and low. "A woman who needs your name for protection, a scandal that needs to be tidied up for the sake of appearances." "Cora," he began, taking a step toward her. "No," she said, whirling to face him, her eyes blazing with a hurt he had never seen before. "I will not do it. I will not trade one cage for another. I did not survive Julian only to marry his shadow. If my name is not good enough on its own, then I will live with the whispers. I will not marry to be protected." He stopped, his expression uncharacteristically lost. He saw his mistake. He had let the preacher's words hang in the air, and in his silence, she had heard an agreement. He walked to her then, and gently, carefully, took her hands in his. She tried to pull away, but he held her fast. "Look at me," he said, his voice a low, urgent plea. He waited until her fiery gaze met his. "I do not give a damn what the preacher says, and I do not give a damn what the town whispers. Their words are wind in the trees. They mean nothing." He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was harder than facing down 3 armed men. This was laying his own scarred soul bare. "I do not want to marry you for appearance's sake, Cora, and I am not asking you to marry me for my protection." He paused, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "I am asking you to marry me because I love you." The words, so simple and so direct, stunned her into silence. He had never said them before. They had lived them, they had shown them, but they had never spoken them aloud. "I love you," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "I love your courage and your quiet strength. I love the way you hum when you work. I love that you have flour on your nose when you bake bread. I loved you when you were a terrified woman who could barely look me in the eye. And I love you now. A woman who can face down death itself. You were never a problem to be solved or a reputation to be saved." He looked deep into her eyes, and his next words held the weight of an unbreakable truth. "You never needed saving. You needed choosing, and I choose you. Every day, I will choose you." Tears welled in Cora's eyes, but these were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a profound, soul-shaking relief. He saw her. He truly, completely saw her. The anger and resentment in her melted away, replaced by a love so vast it filled her to the point of breaking. She raised a trembling hand to his face, her fingers tracing the rough line of his jaw. She looked at this quiet, honorable man who had offered her not a shield, but a partnership, not a cage, but a home. She leaned in, her lips close to his, and she whispered the words that had become their sacred text, but she infused them with a new and eternal meaning. "Touch me like you mean it," she said. It was not a plea. It was not a challenge. This time, it was a vow. They were married a week later, not in a church, but in the cabin. The preacher was not invited. Their only witnesses were the silent, watching pines and the great, snow-capped mountains. The last of the winter snow still lingered on the highest peaks, stubborn patches of white against the new green of the world. But inside the cabin, the fire burned bright, and it was warm. They spoke simple vows, words they had written themselves, promises of partnership, of respect, of a shared life. When he slid a simple, hand-carved wooden ring onto her finger, it felt more real, more binding than any band of gold. The seasons turned. The last of the snow melted, and the valley exploded into a riot of green. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in swaths of blue and yellow and red. Life, fierce and tenacious, had returned. One perfect spring morning. Cora stood barefoot on the small porch Eli had built, the rough-hewn planks warm beneath her feet. The sun was on her face, and a gentle breeze, smelling of pine and damp earth, stirred the tendrils of her hair. She closed her eyes, just feeling the sun, the air, the solid foundation beneath her, feeling alive. She heard him come up behind her. He did not speak, but she felt his familiar presence. He wrapped his old sheepskin coat around her shoulders, the same one he had given her on that first, terrifying day. The gesture was no longer that of a stranger offering charity, but of a husband offering a familiar, comforting warmth. It smelled of him, of wood smoke and leather and home. She leaned back against his solid chest, and he wrapped his arms around her, his hands coming to rest over hers in front of her. She turned her head, smiling up at him. She took one of his large, calloused hands and pressed it flat against her chest, over her heart. It was a gesture of complete and utter trust, an echo of a firelit night that had changed everything. "See?" she whispered, her smile radiant. "Still beating?" He lowered his head and kissed her, a long, slow kiss that tasted of coffee and sunlight and the promise of 1,000 more mornings just like this one. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms, as the wind brushed through the pines, singing a quiet, ancient song. They were two scarred souls, carved and battered by the world, who had found in each other's broken pieces not a mirror of their own pain, but the means to become whole. Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from to connect with fellow fans of the West. Do not forget to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.